Hi. The door burst open, slamming against the wall, and a man I'd never seen before stormed into my house, rage written all over his face. I barely had time to react before he was pointing a finger at me, his voice booming. "You bastard," he shouted. "You beat up my son." I stood there, stunned, watching him. Shannon, my wife, was beside me, her face turning pale, eyes darting between us like a cornered animal. "Your son?" I asked, my voice cold, trying to make sense of the chaos unraveling in front of me. "Yes, my son," he yelled, stepping closer. "He told me you broke his arm when he tried to talk to your daughter." The irony stung, but I kept my face steady. I'd been waiting for something like this. Ever since I'd uncovered Shannon's little secret with this guy, Tony, her so-called friend, I knew I'd be seeing him sooner or later. But not like this, and definitely not in my own home. I glanced at Shannon, expecting her to finally say something, maybe even defend me. Instead, she crossed her arms, looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a strange mix of defiance and satisfaction. "Your son tried to get too close to my daughter," I said calmly, meeting Tony's glare head-on. "And yeah, I had to break his arm." There was a silence, thick and heavy, and then Tony let out a low, mocking laugh. "Well," he sneered, "if I'm screwing your wife, guess it's fair if he gets with your daughter." The room seemed to freeze as Tony's words hung in the air. My heart hammered, rage flooding through me with a force that nearly made me lose control. This stranger, this arrogant, smirking intruder, was standing in my house, sneering about my daughter as if she were some piece of property, as if our entire family was just another sick game to him. I clenched my fists, taking a step toward him. "Get out," I said, my voice low, barely controlled. "Get out before I do something we'll both regret." He just laughed, that infuriating grin spreading wider. "Or what? You'll try to break my arm too?" He took a step forward, challenging me. "Face it, Ben, you couldn't keep your wife satisfied, and now you're scared to deal with the consequences." I glanced at Shannon, hoping that this was where she'd finally realize how far she'd let this go, that she'd see what this man was, how twisted he'd become. But she just stood there, watching, her arms crossed, completely unmoved. In her eyes, there was no shock, no remorse, just cold indifference. "Are you really just going to stand there?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "Are you okay with this? With him talking about our daughter like this?" Shannon's eyes flicked to me, her expression barely shifting. "Oh, come on, Ben. Stop being so dramatic." Her tone was flat, dismissive, like this whole thing was just a mild inconvenience to her. "Maybe if you'd been a little more interesting, we wouldn't be in this situation." I felt a sharp sting, her words piercing deeper than I thought possible. I was shaking, my mind racing between anger, disbelief, and the gut-wrenching realization that she truly didn't care about any of this. She was willing to let Tony mock and threaten me, willing to stand there as he insinuated things about our daughter, all because, in her twisted logic, this was somehow my fault. Tony took a step back, clearly enjoying every second of this. "Look," he sneered, "if you want, we can work something out. You don't have to get hurt here, Ben. Just, stay out of my way. Let Shannon live her life." His smug confidence, his complete disregard for the damage he'd caused, was the last straw. I felt the anger boiling over, seething past the point of control. Without thinking, I lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. For a moment, his arrogance faltered, his smirk fading as he realized I wasn't playing his game anymore. "You want to play the tough guy?" I spat, inches from his face. "Fine. Let's see how tough you really are." He struggled against my grip, but I held firm, feeling a surge of satisfaction at his surprise, his fear. Shannon's voice broke through the haze of my anger, sharp and mocking. "Oh, look at you," she sneered. "Finally showing some backbone. Too little, too late, Ben. I released Tony, letting him stumble back, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. I turned to Shannon, her words ringing in my ears, realizing that this woman standing in front of me was nothing like the one I'd married. This was a stranger, someone who no longer held any trace of love or respect. Tony straightened himself, his smug look returning as he adjusted his collar. "You're pathetic, Ben," he spat, wiping the corner of his mouth as if I'd actually managed to wound his pride. "Keep trying to be the hero. But it's not going to change anything." The room was silent, charged with tension, all three of us locked in a standstill of resentment, betrayal, and bitterness. I knew then that there was no going back, no fixing what was broken. "So that's it?" I asked, turning to Shannon one last time, hoping, against all reason, that she might say something, do something to make sense of this, to give me even a hint that she regretted any of it. She just shrugged, her face blank, unbothered. "What do you want me to say, Ben? We both know this marriage has been dead for a long time." Her words landed like a slap, the final nail in the coffin. There was nothing left. She was right, whatever we'd once had was gone, lost in lies and deceit. And she didn't care. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I turned toward the door. "You know what, Shannon? You're right. This marriage is over." I headed toward the door, ignoring Tony's mocking chuckle and Shannon's indifferent gaze. The weight of betrayal pressed on my chest, but I felt something else too, a sense of release. This chapter was closing, and whatever came next, it was going to be mine. Not theirs. As I reached the doorway, Tony's voice echoed behind me, one last taunt that sent a shiver down my spine. "Don't worry, Ben. I'll take good care of her." I paused, letting his words settle. Then, without looking back, I stepped out into the night, leaving them both behind, knowing this was just the beginning. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, chilling the sweat on my forehead. I took a few deep breaths, trying to regain some sense of control, but my mind was reeling. My own wife had stood by, watching me get humiliated, barely flinching. And her lover, Tony, this arrogant man who'd walked into my house as if he owned it, had taunted me, threatened me, and made it clear he felt entitled to everything in my life, even my family. But if he thought I was going to roll over, he was dead wrong. I turned back to the house, watching the lights in the windows, my hands clenched in fists. Shannon had made it clear where her loyalties lay, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She wanted to play games, to bring this stranger into our home, into our lives. Then she would have to face the consequences. Without thinking, I walked back toward the door, intent on taking some kind of action. But before I reached it, I heard voices. Muffled, but loud enough to pick up on their tone. I pressed myself to the side of the window, listening. "Are you serious, Tony?" Shannon's voice hissed, frustration clear in her tone. "What were you thinking, barging in here like that? You just made everything worse." "Oh, relax," Tony replied, his tone dismissive. "The guy's a pushover. He's not going to do anything. He'll just run off and lick his wounds, exactly what I told you would happen." I felt a fresh wave of anger. Pushover? That's what she'd been telling him about me? All those nights I'd thought she was out with friends or working late, she'd been feeding him lies, tearing down my character, mocking the man who'd been there for her through everything. But there was more. I could hear Tony's voice drop, something about a plan, but it was too quiet to catch the details. "I thought you'd finally deal with him," Shannon whispered, her tone colder than I'd ever heard it. "If you don't, he might try to take the house, even try to use the kids against me." I froze, barely able to comprehend what I was hearing. She wasn't just betraying me with Tony, she was plotting to strip me of everything, to paint me as the villain in front of my own kids. She was already 2 steps ahead, planning how to twist things to make it look like I was the unstable one. The pushover. And she knew exactly how to do it. The anger was no longer just a fire in my veins, it was a volcano erupting, a surge that couldn't be controlled. I couldn't just walk away, not with them thinking they'd won, thinking they could trample on everything I'd built without consequences. I stepped away from the window, my mind spinning with possibilities. They were underestimating me, thinking I'd leave, that I'd fall apart and give them everything without a fight. But they didn't know what I was capable of. Not anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I never thought I'd use. My best friend, Mark, a divorce attorney with a reputation for never losing. As the phone rang, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction settle over me. I might have been a pushover once, but that version of me had died the moment Shannon and her lover started plotting against me. Mark answered after a couple of rings, his voice groggy. "Ben? It's late, man. What's going on?" "I need your help," I said, my voice steady. "Shannon's been cheating on me. And she's planning to use the kids, the house, everything against me. She wants to make sure I walk away with nothing." The pause on the other end was brief. Mark didn't need any more explanation. "All right," he said, his voice sharpening. "We're not letting her get away with this. Come over first thing tomorrow, and we'll go through every step. She's not taking a cent from you if I have anything to say about it." As I hung up, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. This wasn't going to be easy, but I wasn't alone in this fight. Shannon had crossed a line, and now, I was ready to push back with everything I had. I walked back to my car, letting the night air cool the simmering anger within me. Tomorrow would be the start of a new chapter, one where I'd take back control of my life, my family, and my home. They could laugh all they wanted now, thinking they'd already won. But they were in for a rude awakening. As I drove away, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Shannon and Tony had turned my life upside down, but they hadn't broken me. If anything, they'd given me the clarity I'd been missing all along. The next morning, I pulled into Mark's driveway just as the sun was rising, painting the sky a dark orange. I'd barely slept, replaying the events of the night over and over, but my resolve had only hardened. Shannon and Tony thought they had me cornered, but they had no idea what was coming. Mark opened the door, still in his robe, with 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. He handed me one as I stepped inside. "You look like you've been through hell, Ben," he said, giving me a once-over. I nodded, taking a long sip of the coffee, grateful for its warmth. "You don't know the half of it." We sat at his dining table, and I laid out everything, the texts I'd found on Shannon's phone, Tony's audacious entrance into my house, the twisted plan I'd overheard them plotting against me. Mark listened intently, his face darkening with each detail. "All right," he said, his voice low and determined. "First, we're going to start with the kids. Shannon wants to paint you as the unstable one, but we're going to make sure that backfires. We'll get statements from friends, colleagues, people who can vouch for you as a father and as a husband. She doesn't get to rewrite history here." I felt a glimmer of hope. Mark was right, I wasn't some faceless man she could bulldoze over. I had friends, a career, a reputation she couldn't touch. I nodded, feeling the determination solidify. "And the house?" I asked, gripping the coffee mug tightly. "I want to make sure she doesn't get a single brick." Mark leaned forward, a hint of a smile on his face. "We'll use the affair to your advantage. Judges aren't kind to people who drag other men into their homes, especially around their kids. And if Tony's son has been a problem, we'll use that too. This will be her mess to clean up." For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. There was a chance, slim but real, that I could get through this without letting them tear my life apart. As I left Mark's house, I felt a strange sense of relief. The path forward was clearer now, and every step took me further from the version of myself that Shannon had torn down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Shannon was cunning, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. The days that followed were a whirlwind. I gathered every piece of evidence Mark had asked for, compiling texts, emails, and financial records. Friends rallied around me, shocked at what I'd uncovered but ready to help in any way they could. It was both comforting and painful to see the support. It reminded me of how much I'd lost and how much I still had to lose if I let Shannon win. Then, a week later, I got a call that blindsided me. "Dad, you need to come pick me up now." It was my daughter, Ellie, her voice shaking on the other end of the line. My heart dropped. "Ellie? Where are you? What happened?" "I'm at school," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "Mom was here with that guy. Tony. He tried to get me to go with him." I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "Stay there, Ellie. I'm on my way." I drove to the school as fast as I could, every fiber of my being consumed with anger and fear. How could Shannon bring that man near our kids, especially after everything that had happened? This was a new low, even for her. When I got to the school, Ellie was waiting at the entrance, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. I pulled her into a hug, feeling a surge of protective rage. "Are you all right?" I asked, pulling back to look at her. She nodded, but there was fear in her eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "Dad," he was saying weird things. About how we'd be a family soon, and how I should start thinking of him as my stepdad. Her voice cracked, and I clenched my fists, barely able to contain my fury. "That's not going to happen, Ellie," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Not as long as I'm here." On the drive home, my mind raced. This wasn't just about Shannon's betrayal anymore. Tony was actively trying to replace me, to worm his way into my kids' lives, to dismantle the family I'd worked so hard to protect. He was already trying to stake a claim, right under my nose. When I got back, I called Mark immediately, telling him what had happened. His reaction was swift and cold. "This changes everything, Ben. Shannon's brought him into the children's lives without your consent. This gives us grounds to accelerate everything, to show she's endangering their well-being." There was a pause on the other end, and then his voice softened. "We're going to make sure she can't keep doing this." The days that followed felt like a chess game, each move carefully calculated. Shannon began to notice, of course, trying to reach out with calls and messages that grew increasingly frantic. But I didn't answer. She'd made her choice. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. Shannon and Tony sat across from me, their confidence flickering as Mark presented every scrap of evidence we'd gathered. Each message, each text, each careless action she'd taken to erode our family. As Mark spoke, I watched Tony's smug grin fade, saw Shannon's face fall, her mask of defiance slipping. When the judge finally announced the decision, Shannon's face crumbled. I'd won full custody of the kids. The house was mine. Shannon was left with nothing but her lies and a man who'd come into my home, thinking he could take everything from me. And as for Tony? His son's behavior and the police report filed about his harassment of my daughter ensured he was banned from ever coming near my family again. As I walked out of that courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months. The storm had passed, and I'd come out on the other side, scarred but stronger. And as I looked back at Shannon one last time, her face twisted in disbelief, I felt nothing but a strange sense of peace. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine to rebuild, free from the lies and betrayal that had once threatened to destroy me. And for the first time, I felt ready to start again. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, like the weight I'd been carrying for months had finally lifted. Ellie and my younger son, Jake, were waiting for me with my sister, their faces lighting up as I walked toward them. I hugged them both tightly, grateful that they didn't have to go back to the chaos Shannon had created. I'd fought for this, for their safety, for our peace, and finally, we could start healing. But just as I started to relax, just as I began to feel a sense of closure, Shannon stormed out of the courthouse doors with Tony on her heels, fury written all over her face. She was done playing nice. There was no more pretense, no more fake charm. She was exposed, raw, and unhinged. She marched up to me, her voice sharp and cutting. "So this is what you wanted, Ben? To make me look like a monster? To tear apart our family and leave me with nothing?" I turned to face her, holding back the anger that her words brought up. "I didn't tear apart anything, Shannon," I said evenly. "You did that the moment you decided to bring him into our lives." I nodded toward Tony, who was standing behind her, his face a storm cloud of barely contained anger. He looked like he was moments away from exploding, and I could tell he wasn't used to being on the losing end. "Oh, please," she scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think this is over? You think a court order is going to keep me away from my kids?" She leaned in, her face inches from mine, her voice lowering to a menacing hiss. "I'll make sure they know exactly what kind of man you really are. You think you can win custody and walk away, Ben? This is far from over." Tony chimed in, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. "Enjoy your little victory while you can. You may have won in court, but we both know that won't stop us." I squared my shoulders, standing firm. "Do what you want, but stay away from my kids, and stay out of my life. You've done enough damage." Shannon's face twisted, and for the first time, she looked genuinely desperate, panicked. She knew her games were over, that there was no one left to manipulate, no more lies to hide behind. But Tony? He wasn't giving up. He looked at me with a cold intensity, a hint of something more dangerous in his eyes, and then, like a sudden strike of lightning, he smirked. "You think you've won, Ben?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "You don't even know the half of it." And with that, they turned and walked away, Shannon's heels clicking against the pavement, Tony's laughter echoing as they disappeared around the corner. I watched them go, a chill running down my spine. Tony's words lingered in the air, unsettling, like a storm that hadn't yet passed. But I had no time to dwell. I turned back to my kids, who were watching me with wide eyes. I knelt down, pulling them into a hug, feeling the resolve to protect them surge through me like never before. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through paperwork, legal documents, everything I'd accumulated during the custody battle. The house was quiet, too quiet, but for the first time, it felt like it was mine. No more Shannon, no more Tony. Just the kids and me, rebuilding from scratch. But as I sifted through the stack of papers, something caught my eye, a note wedged between the pages. It was handwritten, shaky, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the handwriting. My stomach twisted as I pulled it out, reading the few words scrawled on the crumpled paper. "This isn't over. You've taken everything, and I'll make you regret it." The handwriting was hers. Shannon's. The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. She was going to make this as hard as possible, dragging out every ounce of bitterness she could muster. I could almost picture her face, her twisted smile as she wrote it, imagining herself winning in some sick, twisted way. I dropped the note, letting it fall onto the table. Fear gnawed at me, but I couldn't let it show. I'd promised my kids peace, safety, a life without her games and manipulation. I was determined to keep that promise, no matter how many threats she threw my way. Over the next few weeks, things were quiet. The kids settled into our new routine, and we finally started to feel like a family again, free from the chaos Shannon had brought into our lives. For a while, it felt almost normal. But then the calls started. Random numbers, late at night, silent when I answered. Messages left on my voicemail that were just breathing. And worse, Ellie started getting strange texts from unknown numbers, messages asking if she missed her mother, telling her not to believe her father's lies. It was Shannon's voice, creeping back into our lives through the phone, finding cracks in the armor I'd built around us. Mark helped me file a restraining order, but Shannon was good at skirting the law, finding ways to get to us without breaking any official lines. Each message, each call, felt like a reminder that she was still there, lurking, waiting for her chance to strike back. One evening, as I was putting Jake to bed, there was a loud bang on the front door. My heart dropped. I knew, somehow, who it would be before I even looked through the peephole. I opened the door to find Shannon standing there, her eyes wild, hair disheveled, clutching a stack of papers. She shoved them toward me, a manic smile on her face. "Thought you could get rid of me, huh?" she sneered, voice unsteady. "Well, I'm not going anywhere. I have rights, Ben. Rights you can't just take away." I took a step back, shielding the doorway with my body, making sure the kids were out of view. "You're violating the order. Leave now, or I'll call the police." "Oh, call them," she spat, her voice thick with contempt. "But it won't change anything. I'll keep coming back. You'll never keep me away from them." The rage in her eyes was fierce, and I could see that she was serious. She'd rather self-destruct than let me move on, than let me have the life I'd fought so hard to rebuild. And standing there, staring her down, I realized something: she'd lost control. This wasn't about love, or even anger, it was about the power she'd lost and couldn't bear to see in my hands. I closed the door, locking it tight, her muffled shouts fading as I walked away. I dialed the police, reporting the violation, and as I hung up, I felt a strange sense of calm. She could keep coming, keep trying to worm her way back in, but she'd never get what she wanted. That night, as I watched my kids sleeping peacefully, I knew I'd won. Shannon could try to haunt us, send her whispers through the phone, show up in person with threats and schemes, but in the end, she was powerless. She was already on the outside, looking in. And that was a reality she'd never escape. A few days passed, and things seemed to settle down again. Shannon had stopped calling, stopped lurking outside, and even her texts to Ellie had slowed. I wanted to believe it was over, that she'd finally accepted the reality and moved on. But a nagging feeling lingered. Shannon wasn't one to give up easily, and I'd seen that look in her eyes, the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. Then, one evening, as I was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner, the doorbell rang. I checked the time. It was late for visitors, especially in our quiet neighborhood. I opened the door cautiously, expecting another delivery mix-up or maybe one of the neighbors. But the man standing there wasn't anyone I recognized. He was tall, built like a linebacker, and had a serious look in his eyes. He wore a dark jacket with the badge of a private investigator embroidered on the pocket. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, his voice steady, formal. I nodded, immediately on edge. "Yes. Can I help you?" "I was hired by your wife, Shannon Thompson, to investigate you." His voice was calm, almost detached, as though this were just another day at work for him. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "What are you talking about?" He pulled out a file and handed it to me, a thick manila folder filled with documents, photos, and handwritten notes. "I was hired to dig up anything and everything about you: personal life, financials, work history, the custody case. She wanted to build a case against you." I swallowed hard, flipping through the documents. Photos of me taking the kids to school, bank statements, lists of people I'd called. She'd been gathering information about me for months, building some twisted version of my life to use against me. My pulse quickened, but then he held up a hand. "But there's more," he said, his tone shifting, becoming almost apologetic. I didn't feel right about the assignment. She offered me more money than I'd ever seen, but the things she wanted me to do were extreme. She wanted me to fabricate evidence against you, to make it look like you were unfit to take care of your kids. And when I told her I couldn't do that, she fired me. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Shannon had been planning this all along, every step, every fake friend who'd suddenly taken an interest in my life, every attempt to paint me as the unstable one. She was trying to destroy me, to rip away everything that mattered to me, even if it meant crossing lines that no decent person would dare. "I don't know why you're telling me this," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "But, thank you." The investigator nodded. I didn't feel right letting it go. There are people who do what she asked, and I have a feeling she'll find them sooner or later. She's desperate, and that makes her dangerous. Just watch your back. I closed the door as he left, the file clutched in my hand. I didn't sleep that night, poring over each piece of information, wondering how I could have missed this dark turn she'd taken. But it made sense, didn't it? Shannon had always been controlling, always good at bending the truth to fit her needs. She was just escalating. The next morning, I went straight to Mark's office with the file. He scanned the documents, a frown deepening on his face as he read through the investigator's notes. Finally, he looked up, his expression grim. "This is serious, Ben. If she's willing to go this far, she's not going to stop. We need to protect you, and the kids." We filed for an immediate restraining order, laying out everything we knew, but a part of me knew that legal boundaries weren't going to stop Shannon. She was out there, plotting, waiting for her next move. And she was willing to play dirty, dirtier than I'd ever imagined. A few nights later, I was woken by a loud crash downstairs. Heart pounding, I jumped out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed. I rushed down the stairs, expecting to find Shannon or, worse, Tony breaking in, but the house was silent, too quiet. I flipped on the lights and saw the window by the back door shattered, glass scattered across the kitchen floor. My stomach twisted as I looked around, half expecting her to jump out of the shadows. But instead, I found something far worse. A small note lay on the floor among the glass shards. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I read the message scrawled in familiar handwriting. "You can't hide them from me forever." It was signed with a heart. A twisted, mocking symbol of her presence. In a panic, I ran upstairs, checking on the kids, making sure the doors and windows were locked. They were safe, still sound asleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare Shannon was crafting around us. But as I watched them, I knew this wasn't something I could fight alone. The next morning, I sat down with them, explaining, carefully, gently, that things were different now, that their mom was going through something, and that they needed to stay close to me, follow the rules, and be cautious around anyone they didn't know. They listened, eyes wide, sensing the gravity of what I wasn't saying. Days turned into weeks, each one bringing a fresh wave of paranoia, each call or creak in the house making my heart pound. Shannon was out there, watching, plotting, and I could feel her presence like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then, just when I thought things might finally settle, I got a call from the school. They told me Ellie hadn't shown up to class that day, that she'd been signed out by her mother. Panic gripped me as I dialed every contact I had, racing to the school, calling Mark, calling the police. Hours ticked by, each one worse than the last, my mind racing with fears of what Shannon might do. Then, finally, my phone rang. It was a private number, but I answered immediately, praying it was Ellie. "Dad?" Her voice came through, small and shaky. "Ellie. Are you all right? Where are you?" There was a pause, a hitch in her voice. "Mom took me somewhere, to some house. She said I wasn't going to see you again." I clenched my fists, feeling a rage and desperation unlike anything I'd ever felt. "Ellie, listen to me. Can you tell me where you are? Anything you can see?" There was a pause, the sound of her breathing, then her whispered voice. "There's a lake, and a red house." I thanked her, whispering that everything would be okay, and hung up, immediately calling Mark, who helped me relay the details to the police. They found her that night, huddled in a small house by the lake, terrified but safe. Shannon was gone, vanished before the police arrived, her trail cold. But as I held Ellie close, promising her that nothing would ever separate us again, I knew it wasn't over. Shannon was out there, her twisted sense of vengeance unfulfilled. But I was ready. I'd been to hell and back, and no matter what game Shannon played next, I would be waiting. She'd taken her last shot, and now, it was my turn. After weeks of searching, checking over my shoulder, and constant tension, life had started to feel stable again. Shannon had disappeared, and despite my fears, there was no sign of her. She had tried to take Ellie, tried to destroy me, but in the end, she'd been the one to disappear. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I was exhausted from the months of drama and clung to the peace that had finally settled over us. One evening, a few months later, the kids and I were sitting down for dinner. The atmosphere was warm, light-hearted. For the first time in ages, I heard real laughter in the house. We talked about their day at school, their plans for the weekend, and for the first time, I felt like I could see the end of this nightmare. Just as I stood up to grab dessert, there was a knock on the door. I froze, exchanging a glance with Ellie, who went quiet, her face suddenly pale. Jake stopped eating, his fork halfway to his mouth. We hadn't had visitors in weeks, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. I walked to the door slowly, half expecting Shannon's face on the other side, some crazed smile, ready to start her game all over again. But as I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Standing there was a police officer, his face somber, hat in hand. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying the weight of bad news. "Yes," I managed, my heart racing. He took a deep breath, casting a quick glance down at the ground. We found Shannon Thompson." I swallowed hard, 1,000 emotions washing over me. "Where? Is she, all right?" The officer shook his head slowly, his expression softening. "We found her body near the lake, a few miles from the house where we recovered Ellie. She appears to have drowned, possibly on the night she took your daughter. There were signs she might have been in distress, and the medical examiner is still investigating, but it looks like an accident." I stood there, speechless, as the officer continued, each word blurring into the next. "Shannon, gone. After everything, after all the games, the threats, the chaos she'd unleashed, her story ended in a way none of us could have expected." The officer offered his condolences, gave me information for the coroner's office, and left, leaving me standing at the threshold, staring out into the dark. The days that followed were a surreal haze. News spread quickly, and people began reaching out, offering their sympathies, their condolences. But I didn't know how to feel. Shannon had been the source of so much pain, had turned our lives into a nightmare, and yet, the finality of it, the emptiness left in her wake, was unsettling. It was over, but not in a way I'd ever imagined. A few weeks later, after the dust had settled, I was cleaning out the last of Shannon's things from the basement. I'd boxed up what little was left of her belongings, and as I moved a stack of old books, something caught my eye, a small, locked box, hidden beneath a pile of clothes. I didn't remember seeing it before. Curious, I pried it open, my fingers shaking slightly. Inside, I found letters, dozens of them, written in Shannon's handwriting. Each one was addressed to me, but they'd never been sent. I picked up the first one, unfolding it slowly, unsure of what I'd find. "Ben," it began, "I know you won't believe me, and maybe you never will, but there's something you need to understand. I didn't start out wanting to hurt you, or the kids. But somewhere along the line, everything spiraled out of control. I kept wanting more, needing more, until nothing was ever enough. I tried to stop myself, to be different, but I just couldn't." Each letter was a confession, an outpouring of guilt and self-loathing, a window into the mind of a woman who'd been unraveling long before I'd realized it. She talked about her struggles, about feeling trapped, about wanting to be a better mother but not knowing how. There were even hints that Tony had manipulated her, fed her lies, made her believe things that weren't true to keep her in his grasp. At the bottom of the box was one final note, written in a messier, shakier hand. I wanted to tell you this myself, but I know I never will. Just know that if anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. I was running, Ben. I was running from something bigger than you know. And now I don't know how to stop. I sat there in stunned silence, the words blurring as I read them over and over. Had she been running that night by the lake, trying to escape something or someone? I thought of Tony, the control he'd tried to exert over her, the way he'd laughed as he tore through my life. It all clicked in an instant. Shannon hadn't been fighting just me, she'd been trapped in a web she hadn't woven herself. And Tony? He was still out there. I took a deep breath, folding the letters back into the box, feeling a strange sense of both closure and dread. Shannon's story had ended, but mine hadn't. She might have been lost, broken, caught up in something dark, but I wasn't. And whatever Tony's game was, he wouldn't find me as easy a target. As I locked the box and placed it back on the shelf, I looked around the quiet, peaceful house that was finally my own. But somewhere out there, I knew, Tony was lurking, waiting for his next move. And I'd be ready for him. After all, this wasn't just about Shannon or me anymore. It was about the life I'd fought to protect and the peace I'd finally won. And no matter what, I wasn't letting it slip away again. Bye for now.